Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here for this week's episode of The Numbers with Philippe J. Fournier. Philippe, how are you doing this week?
Good morning, Eric. I'm doing very well. I was a bit under the weather for the past few days, but feeling much better now. It feels, don't you think, Eric, it feels like the calm after the storm, after all these October elections, the American elections. Now, there's still the Nova Scotia election, but it's much more manageable to have one election at a time, isn't it?
I find it very enjoyable. I'm actually like paying a lot more attention to one than having to kind of just go in a little bit for each of them. And actually, yeah, it's actually been nice. But I think it's going to actually be pretty busy for a little while. The latest, we'll talk about it later, but the latest rumors I've seen, an Ontario call sometime in January, February, and that's going to just roll right into a federal. And then it's going to be very, very, very quiet for a long time.
Yep.
Although there might be some leadership races. Anyway, that's very far ahead of us. This week we got quite a bit to talk about. We got some federal polls. We got a by-election call that came. We have Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec polls. So why don't we dive right in? Let's start with that by-election call. So this is in Cloverdale, Langley City, which is a riding in the Greater Vancouver area. This is a seat that the Liberals won in 2021. They had lost it in 2019 to the Conservatives. They had won it in 2015. So it is a swing seat in a close election. I don't think it's going to be a swing seat this time. I don't think it's going to be close.
The results were close. I mean, in 2019, if you take the data from that election, transpose onto the new map, because I think the borders changed a little bit in that riding, it was Conservative +2 in 2019, and then Liberal +3 in 2021. So if we consider, Eric, the numbers we see out of British Columbia, the federal numbers we see out of that province, how big would that margin be? Like 15, 20, 18 points maybe between the Conservatives and Liberals? Unless there's some super local, hyper-local effect that we're missing. But what would you say would be your estimated, your guess for this riding?
Yeah, it's so, the polls in BC have swung by nearly 20 points since the last election.
Yeah.
So a 3-point margin, it almost feels inevitable that the Liberals are going to lose this. This is so different from the other two by-elections, the Toronto St. Paul's and the La Salle-Mont-Verdun, where there needed to be like a big thing happening for the Liberals to lose it, and the big things happened. This one, it's almost like, well, of course they're going to lose it. And because they only won it by 3 points, it is a suburban kind of riding. Conservatives are doing so well in BC. The BC Conservatives just won this part of the province just last month. There's almost no chance. The Liberals have a candidate who is not a known person. It's maybe perhaps known locally in her community, but not a big name. The Conservatives have the same person who ran the last two times, who was an MP for a little while. So my question here is not so much what the result's going to be, because I think it's going to be a big loss, a 15-point loss or something like that for the Liberals. Yeah. But will it change anything, this by-election?
What do we think? Why is it so close to Christmas? So we can bury it in the news and then forget about it? That's maybe one reason, right?
Well, they had to call it by November 30th. And that means that they would have had to set the date. The latest they could have set the date would have been somewhere around like mid-January, which means that it would have been a campaign running over Christmas. So I think this was sort of the last possible date they could have chosen without it being kind of silly. But you're right. Like, I mean, the House isn't going to be sitting anymore, and people are going to be thinking about the holidays. That's right. So the loss won't sting as much, perhaps, but assuming that the Liberals lose it.
Yeah.
It'll be a loss in Toronto, a loss in Montreal, and then a loss in Greater Vancouver. And then they have a by-election, if it ever happens, in Halifax, which they might also lose. Ooh. I mean, think about that. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Atlantic Canada.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the Liberal caucus, the Liberal base right now. And it's more symbolic, the loss here, I think, than it will be indicative of anything. But I mean, it's just another by-election that the Liberals can't really afford to have. They would have almost been better to have the House dissolved so they can avoid it. Maybe not.
I mean, it seems like we're saying that the Conservatives, it's inevitable that the Conservatives will win, But just think about this. I mean, the Liberals just lost, as you said, Toronto St. Paul's and La Salle-Verdun. In that context, there's no way that they save face in suburban Vancouver. It's no way. But, I mean, the voters will decide. They will go to the polls. They will have their vote. It's just, right now, I have a 20-point lead in my projection. Naturally, there's an uncertainty in there. It could be 10, it could be 12, it could be 25. But I think we'll spend not too much time talking about this one. We were asked by our members on the Discord whether we were going to do a live stream for this one. Well, the thing is, it starts at midnight.
Our time, yeah.
Our time. It's a weekday. So, we will talk about it, but there won't be a live stream for this one. Am I right about this, Eric? I mean, you didn't.
We're going to have to pass. We don't know what if the longest ballot committee is going to act again. But our last live stream lasted 5 hours.
Yeah.
I don't think I want to be up at 5 a.m. to talk about a 20-point Conservative win, although we might actually be able to call it within like an hour. But,
that's true. That's true.
It's still really late. So we're not going to do a live stream for that one. We're sorry, folks. This is the curse of being out on this side of the country. But we'll definitely talk a lot about it. We'll do an over-under as well once we get closer to the date. Just to set some expectations. But the expectations, I think, are low going into it, which is probably going to soften the blow of a defeat and also soften the victory, the triumph of a Conservative win there, because I think almost everybody expects that this is going to go. Probably because of where the polls are. Yeah. Well, probably. Exactly because of where the polls are. So we've got actually a lot of polls that came out over the last week. I think after all those pollsters who might have been standing aside, letting the U.S. election take center stage, got back into the field. Why don't you take us through some of those polls that we had over the last week?
So not much variance, save for one. We have an Abacus, Léger, and usual nanos. We also had a Léger Quebec poll, which contained federal numbers. We'll talk about that. So Léger has a 16-point lead for the Conservatives, 42-26. Abacus, a little wider lead, but the numbers are similar. 41 Conservatives, 22 Liberal. 20 for the NDP in Abacus, and 15 for the NDP in Léger. And Nanos, continues to oscillate. I mean, again, Nanos converge to the others as we kind of expected. 41 Conservative, 25 Liberal, 19 NDP. And then we had the Ecos poll. 39 Conservatives, 28 Liberal, a little higher, and 17 for the NDP. But we discussed the Ecos poll, the first half, or the October poll, I think we discussed this last week, the unfinished poll that had 12 people in Manitoba. I'm not sure I want to get too far into that, but Eric, what do you see in these numbers? What's your general view for now?
Well, we do see the Conservatives are in the low 40s, which I think is actually something that might be a little bit of a new development. We have seen now a number of polls now that have more in the 41, the 42, rather than the 43, 44. So it could be that they've come down a little bit, and maybe the Ecos poll is a bit of an exaggeration of it, let's just say, on the lower end of that range. I do find the difference that we see between the Léger poll and the Abacus or the Nanos poll when it comes to the Liberals and the NDP pretty interesting, because for Léger, Liberals are at 16 and the NDP is at 15. And then when you look at Abacus, the Liberals are at 22 and the NDP is at 20. So it's more of a relation there between those two parties than between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And so I do have some questions about where the NDP stands. Are they closer to 15 or are they closer to 20? Because that does have a big impact, I think, on the Liberals, because the closer the NDP are to the Liberals, then the Liberals have to worry not only about all of their seats going to the Conservatives in the suburbs and the inner suburbs of places like Toronto, but also some of those downtown seats in Toronto, maybe Montreal, maybe in cities out in Atlantic Canada, that they also go to the NDP. So there's, I think, something that is important there that we don't really know how it's going to play out until the future is revealed to us. But it does seem like largely steady as she goes. Conservatives maybe down a little bit. Maybe the Liberals are coming back up a little bit from this period where they seem to be almost getting closer to the NDP. But not a huge amount of differences, I don't think, for me, from these numbers just yet.
Yeah, the Liberals, I think I've said this before, but I'm looking at these numbers, Eric, and Liberals are really lucky to have Jagmeet Singh leading the NDP. Okay, so if you look at the numbers of for Monsieur Jagmeet Singh, the personal numbers. So Abacus has those trackers, positive impressions, negative impressions, and the numbers have been steady for both Trudeau and Poilievre. Poilievre is around the even mark. Trudeau obviously is deep in the red. And impressions of Jagmeet Singh for the longest time were lukewarm, slightly in the positive. They switched to negative in the past few months. 39% negative, 30% positive. That's a -9. We have a good guess where the switch happens. When those numbers got worse is when the NDP tore up the agreement with the Liberals, and so suddenly many Liberal voters were not too fond of Mr. Singh. But Mr. Singh himself, I don't think he's proved to be a highly effective campaigner. He's lost seats in past elections. He hasn't been able to lift the NDP up in 21. And now he has worse personal numbers. So, you know, those swing voters between the NDP and Liberal, if the NDP was led by a new or very charismatic leader or a very good campaigner, the Liberals would be in so much trouble. But in the polls right now, the NDP still has ground to catch up to get the Liberals, on average, of course.
Do you think, though, that for Jagmeet Singh, is he preventing the NDP from doing better, or is he just not taking advantage of the opportunity? Is he doing as well as you would expect an NDP leader to do? Because, you know, you and I have been watching polls for a very long time. These are typical numbers for the NDP, right? It's not like just before 2019 when they were starting to get 12 and 13%. Like, these are historically decent numbers for the NDP. So is Jagmeet Singh almost like a generic NDP leader? And it's that if they had someone who is able to take advantage of the Liberals, then they'd be over 20? Or is he actually preventing them from getting over 20? Would they be over 20 if they had a generic NDP leader? Like, is he adding, or is he subtracting, or is he just keeping them at the level that they would have been otherwise? That's my question when it comes to Singh.
It's a good question. The thing is, if you make a sports analogy, you have a team early in the season that is expected to play 500, and then at the end of the season, they played 500. Do you say the coach did a good job? Or do you do a good job if all you do is keep your boat at sea level, right? The thing is, Jack Layton, and I know we always get back to this, but proved that there was a possibility, an opening in Quebec especially, for progressive voters to go to. There are still progressive voters in Quebec. They're not heading to the NDP. The NDP has trouble breaking double digits in Quebec. And I know it's not all about Quebec, but we know that in 2011, that rise of the NDP was first mostly driven by Quebec. And so I look at these numbers and I go like, okay, so what did you do to raise your party? You didn't. You just left it at the level it's been on average for the past 50 years. And as you said, opportunity. Right now, the Liberals sont dans les câbles, as we say in French. They're in trouble, and still you can't get above that mark. We'll discuss Mr. Singh's leadership, I'm sure we will, after the next federal election, maybe the spring, maybe the summer. But I'm looking at these numbers, and the NDP doesn't seem to be in position to challenge the Liberals, at least for now.
The Conservatives, like I said, might be down a tick or two from where they were before. Abacus does find that Pierre Poilievre's negatives are now, his negatives have gone up a little bit, and it seems like they're staying at a little bit of a higher level. So maybe he has reached a bit of a ceiling in terms of his ability to move forward. But there was the Leger poll that came out of Quebec. So this was a large sample poll in Quebec. They had provincial numbers. We'll talk about them in a little bit. But the federal numbers had the Bloc still leading, and pretty much where almost right in the middle of where every pollster has them, at 35% in the province. But the Conservatives were second at 24%. The Liberals had 22%. There was a funny kind of headline we saw from the Journal de Montréal, more or less making it sound like the Conservatives have moved into first place ahead of the Liberals in Quebec, rather than a fight for quite a distant second. But as What was your reflections when you saw these numbers come out?
Okay, so we know the Liberals are in trouble in Quebec. They had poor numbers. They had poor numbers since basically they started tanking last year. Quebec was the last bastion for the Liberals where they could hope at least to win, I don't know, maybe 30 seats or something. It looks like this gone. Even the non-francophone vote in Quebec.
Yeah.
So it's right now we see that Léger poll. Okay, it's a small sample of non-francophones, but it's not numbers that are unfamiliar to us. 39% Liberal, 31% Conservatives. So with these numbers, there are some seats in Montreal that I'm not saying the Conservatives will win, but at least it'll be close because those Liberal voters, that number, that 39% should be much higher in a normal election. And when you look at the Francophone vote, again, it's a large sample size only of Quebec, 45% for the Bloc Québécois, 21 for the Conservatives, 16 for the Liberals. So will there be any Liberal seat in Francophone Quebec? And I say Francophone Quebec, what I usually mean is outside of Montreal, Laval, and Gatineau. Eastern Townships, no. Quebec City, no. I mean, in Quebec City, 253 cases, 38 Bloc, 37 Conservatives, 15 Liberal. So even Monsieur Duclos, Monsieur Lightbound, and just on the outskirts of Quebec City, it would be very, very hard for them to replicate their past victories with such numbers regionally. So yeah,
go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I don't see the Conservatives making much gains with these numbers. I mean, they would be happy with a 24% in Quebec. Maybe a few pickups, maybe Trois-Rivières or something. But mostly the Bloc is looking really strong. And we're not talking about the good days of Gilles Duceppe where they win 50 seats, but it's close. The split vote makes, I think, 45 to 50 seats for the Bloc Québécois within range.
What complicates things for the Liberals, too, it's just kind of emblematic of what kind of campaign it's setting up to be across the country. But in Quebec, they would have normally had to spend more of their time, their resources fighting the Bloc in those Francophone ridings, which they're still going to have to do. But they might also have to put some resources into the West Island. As you said, the Conservatives probably are not going to break through. They could, maybe in Pierrefonds, maybe in Montreal.
Montreal, yeah.
But the Liberals shouldn't have to worry about that. Those should only be local campaigns where the local, riding association raises the money, and that's what but they might actually have to spend some time and some money there. And so if their focus is going to be divided on, trying to keep these seats that they normally don't have to worry about in Montreal, that just takes away fewer resources from the rest of Quebec, and it also takes fewer resources and time from the rest of the country. And it's going to be a lot of races like that, where normally they had 50 seats they totally didn't have to worry about. Yeah. Now this time it's like, how do we make sure we don't drop below those 50 seats? So, the Quebec poll is just part of that larger narrative that's shaping up to be pretty rough for the Liberals right now.
Just a word about that poll again. The age breakdown was a trip. I mean, it's. Again, we have to be careful with subsamples, but they're not that small of subsamples. They're larger than federal polls, subsamples for the prairies and BC usually. So the Bloc Québécois, we know that the Bloc Québécois is much more popular amongst older voters, and that's a good thing when you want to get more votes, right? You want to beat your polls. So the Bloc Québécois, 15% among the young, from 18 to 34. But 48% amongst the 55 and over. And so you can make a little calculation here. We don't have that breakdown because it would be too small of a subsamples. But if you take 55 and over and Francophone, the Bloc is close to 55%, maybe closing in almost to 60. So older voters, which we know are much more likely to vote in greater numbers, really are massively behind the Bloc Québécois. And to go back to the young numbers from 18 to 34, who's first? The Conservatives. Poilievre's Conservatives. And for those who haven't been paying attention, we're talking about a Quebec poll here. So 33% for the Conservatives, 27% for the NDP, 17% for the Liberals, and the Bloc is at 15%. That's among Quebec youth. We're about to see some realignment coming here. I mean, those numbers, I'm not taking it at face value, but I see that there's clear movement and generational divide in Quebec between the older voter and younger voters. And I think Pierre Poilievre could really go hard after that youth vote and make a few surprises in the next election.
Can you imagine a Quebec debate between supporters of different parties, and the young people are Conservatives and New Democrats in Quebec? Just not, I mean, things have changed if that's how it's going to be. We'll see.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's move to Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is voting on November 26th. Doesn't look like it's going to be too competitive of an election, but it is still worth our attention nevertheless. So we had two polls come out over the last week. We had one from MQO Research, which is a huge blast from the past. When I started out 15 years ago, they were one of the pollsters. They came out every week, every quarter which was then called Corporate Research Associates, which is now Narrative Research. And MQO hasn't put out a public voting intentions poll for a couple of years, so it was I was surprised to see one. They had the PCs at 47, the NDP was at 24, the Liberals at 20, the Greens at 7. The Greens aren't going to get 7; they have half a slate, so that's they're going to end up at 3 or 2 if they're lucky. And then we had another one from Abacus, a sample that was about twice the size of MQO. MQO had a very small one. 47 again for the PCs, 25 for the Liberals, 23 for the NDP, 4 for the Greens. PC's winning 40, 45 seats with this?
I think the question in this election, and I know, again, voters will get to decide, but we get those numbers, Eric. The real interesting part of this election will be who finishes second, right?
Yeah.
The Liberals have, I think, the higher ceiling, but they have the much lower floor. You can see with these numbers, the Nova Scotia Liberals, Mr. Churchill and his team, just accumulating second place finishes everywhere and maybe getting 2 or 3 seats at the most. And the leader could lose as well in Yarmouth, I think it's called, Yarmouth.
Yeah.
But thing is, the numbers, when you look at Abacus's numbers of the leaders, Claudia Chandler has the highest. I'm sorry, what? Chender, sorry, Miss Claudia Chender, sorry, has the best numbers as for leaders. She has a 35 positive, 9 negative only. Okay, so 18% don't know her, but that's still at plus 26 according to Abacus. Zach Churchill is a plus 6, and the Premier, Mr. Houston, is at plus 8. So is there a greater potential for growth with a leader that is more popular? Maybe. I'm not sure how strong the NDP machine is outside of the more densely populated areas, but you said how many? You said 40 to 45 seats out of 55. Yeah, we're looking at a crushing, easy majority for Tim Houston. It doesn't seem that the wave of anti-incumbents is hitting Mr. Houston just yet.
No, like you said, he's a net positive. Yeah. Chender doing so well does make you wonder. I think there's a debate on tonight as we're recording. So could be an opportunity for her, if people do already like her, for her to move ahead. That Abacus does have the Liberals in second. This is the first poll that has had the Liberals in second. All the other ones have had them a couple of points behind the NDP. But as you said, like the regional numbers are going to be really difficult for the Liberals. But for Houston, from the Abacus poll, when you look at the issues, healthcare is what they got elected on in 2021. That's what they defeated Rankin and the Liberals on. And on those who say it's a top issue, who's best to deal with healthcare, the PCs are at 32 and the Liberals and the NDP are at 17 apiece.
Yeah.
If that's your top issue and you're still more or less doubling any other party, because, in Saskatchewan, the polls, might have missed in the overall result, but it was pretty clear that the NDP was favored on healthcare. We saw that in Manitoba, where the NDP was favored on healthcare over the PCs. I believe we also saw it in BC that the British Columbians trusted the NDP over this. There's no problem here on healthcare, which is probably the most important issue in Nova Scotia, when the PCs are doing so much better. And even on making life more affordable, it's 28 PC, 18 NDP, 14 Liberal. Again, those are the two election deciding issues in a province. And the PCs are doing fine on them. They're only trailing by a teeny bit on improving housing and reducing homelessness. But I do kind of expect that voters recognize there's not that much that you can do in a short amount of time, and especially at the provincial level. So there's not really much of an indication that Houston is even at risk of losing a lot of ground. But who knows what happens in a debate. Once in a while you say something dumb and like it gets you in trouble, like Jim Prentice back in Alberta in 2015. But yeah, this does look like it's going to be a bit of a cruise for the rest of the remaining 12 days for Tim Houston and the PCs.
So the 90-minute debate, yes, indeed, is tonight, November 14th at 7:30 local time. So I'm sure we will have our Discord members watch this and discuss this. Looking forward to this. I mean, leaders debate. I don't want to be cynical here, but it feels like provincial leaders debate are not that big a deal unless somebody really stumbles. And I say this outside of Quebec. So unless somebody really stumbles, I mean, Monsieur Houston is sitting on a pile of safe seats right now. You would have to really stumble. And again, the question, I think, is who finishes second. And it could matter in the long run. So looking forward to see how it unfolds. You mentioned healthcare, Eric. It's funny how many elections don't have healthcare as a top issue, right? I mean, healthcare makes or breaks governments. I mean, the CEQ Legault was talking about this 6 years ago, and now when we look at the numbers for François Legault and healthcare, they're terrible. So, yeah, I mean, the issue of healthcare will always come back because it's always a system that is under lots of stress. Any province, anywhere in Canada. So, and very interesting.
All right, someone who doesn't seem like they're under that much stress would be Doug Ford out in Ontario.
Because all the problems are fixed in Ontario. Haven't you heard, Eric? It's
You just need to dig a tunnel under them, and then you're good.
That's right.
So, Ontario, I think we're going to be talking a lot about more and more, especially once Nova Scotia has passed this, because it does seem very likely that it is the next election on the docket. Everybody in the province seems to be preparing for an early election. January, February calls. That would put a February, March election date. It's looking a lot like, I'll rephrase this.
Okay.
The top line numbers look a little bit like what we see in Nova Scotia. The numbers underneath are not the same as what we see in Nova Scotia. So we had a new poll from Abacus. Same kind of numbers we've seen from them for a while. 42 for the PCs, 26 for the Liberals, 22 for the NDP, 7 for the Greens. So you have that divided opposition. But unlike Houston, Ford is not himself particularly popular. He's a net negative in terms of his own ratings. His government gets pretty low satisfaction ratings. But unlike in Nova Scotia, the two opposition leaders also not really all that well liked either.
Yeah.
So I guess you default to winning.
I mean, Doug Ford doesn't have great personal numbers. He didn't in 2022, and he still won a crushing majority. So there's something else. I know there's, again, the PC base, that unmovable PC base in Ontario. But maybe it seems that there are a lot of people who don't like Doug Ford, but they don't really don't like him. They don't like him. But you just mentioned the leaders in Nova Scotia. All of them have a positive ratings. They're in the positive when you have positive impressions and negative impressions. It's the opposite here. So the only one that has a positive, it's Merit Style, and it's +1. It's a meager +1. Even Schreiner, the Green leader in Ontario, who used to have the better numbers, is now a -4. I'm not sure if
Styles being +1 is kind of new. The last time they were in the field, she was a negative.
Yeah, she was negative. But she was not like a -20, right? Ford is a -11. It's not good, but 34% of positive impressions, that's almost all you need. In Ontario, if you get 35%, getting to 40 is a cherry on top for the PCs. So you updated your Ontario projection last week with the Abacus's numbers, didn't you?
Yeah. Yes, and so did you, I think, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah, that's why. I have to say, I was really busy. I didn't look. I usually consult your website all the time, Eric, but I didn't this time. So What did you have as a seat projection for Ontario with the numbers we have right now? What does it look like?
I think what is exactly what you had. 91 seats for the PCs, 18 for the NDP,
No
12
way.
for the Liberals,
You had the
2
same?
for the Greens, 1 independent. Yeah, we had the exact same numbers.
Oh, man, now
so it's
I'm
a
worried.
consensus. We all agree this is what it's going to be.
Let's skip the election then, just ask us, right?
Yeah.
But 91 seats for the PCs. So Doug Ford, when he took power...
Third term.
Not only a third term, but getting stronger at every term, right? This rarely happens. We talked about, I think, Gary Dewar in Manitoba, and there were, I think, what's his name in Nova Scotia, who
Stanfield did it.
Stanfield. Every election got stronger and stronger, but that's the exception. That's not the rule. So in 2018, Doug Ford won 76 seats, I believe it was.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Then he won 83. And now my projection has him at 91, benefiting from all these vote splits, 91 seats out of the legislature that has 124. So nothing sticks to Ford. The opposition parties cannot find a way to pierce that armor. And I look at Miss Crombie's numbers, 24% positive, 31% negative. She's the new leader. She should have better numbers than this. We'll see during a campaign if she can turn this around, but I see the Liberals barely reaching party status with this.
So it'll still be tough.
Yeah, third majority.
Yeah, it looks like that. And just to go back one last minute on what you said about Ford's numbers and people not really hating him. When you look at the abacus always includes the neutral. And for Crombie and Stiles, the neutral is about 28%. For those leaders, to me, when I see neutral, I don't really know that much about them. They seem fine, I guess. That's what I see, because they're opposition leaders. But for Ford, everybody knows Doug Ford. Everybody has a view of him. So if you're 19% neutral, that probably means you're like, I'm fine with him, whatever. Yeah. And I think that's how they keep getting elected. Turnout's low because you have a lot of voters who are not that cheesed off about him enough to go out and vote, and the people who like him, that's enough. And I think that's really been their formula, not to rile up Ontarians too much, and Ontarians are hard to rise up.
Yes, they are.
and just kind of coast on a bit of indifference, and I think it's a very interesting formula and strategy on the part of the Ford PCs. It seems tough to beat right now, but as we saw with François Legault, and we thought he had a recipe for maybe staying in for a very long time, and now you see that those things can fall apart very quickly. So right now it looks really good for Doug Ford. Doesn't mean it always will, but if an election in February, March could still go pretty well for him.
One last thing on that Ontario poll from Abacus. Do you know that people like money? They like receiving free money from the government. Well, it's not free, but...
well, someone else's money, I assume.
As you may have heard, Doug Ford wants to send checks to every person in Ontario. 27% think it's a very good idea. 19% say it's a good idea, so that's 46%. That's almost half people want to get that $200, which will pay for 1/2 of a groceries for family in 1 week's
Christmas, a couple Christmas gifts. There you go.
Yeah. So
I don't know when we're getting it. It was supposed to be in January, maybe.
Well, you would think strategically.
The day before the election, maybe. Is that the date?
That would. Are you so cynical, Eric? I think just before Christmas would be the way to go to make sure that money goes back into the system. But yeah, people like money, and maybe. François Legault did it. It worked for a while. Maybe Doug Ford says, you know what, people like money. I like money too. Let's give them what they want. That poll shows me that, 10% say it's a very bad idea and 11% say it's a bad idea. That's 21%. So even though you may think that it's an awful idea to spend literally billions just giving away money to people, polls show that people like that. So...
Yeah. Well, if you don't think the government's going to spend it very well, then might as well give it back to me. All right. We'll do one last poll. This was from Quebec. It was the Léger poll for the Journal de Montréal. 35% for the Parti québécois, 21% for the Coalition Avenir Québec, which is the governing party, 17% for the Quebec Liberals, 13% for Quebec Solidaire, and 11% for the Conservatives. I was surprised to see a 35. That either ties or is the highest we've seen from Léger for the PQ. I thought that they would had hit a bit of a sugar high and were going to tail off a little bit, but it's the exact same support as the Bloc. It's just I know it's not all the same voters, but it's this 35 for the PQ, up 14 points, big majority government.
Okay, well, I have to say I'm not surprised, like at all. The Liberals don't have a leader yet, so you see that there's potential depending on who they choose to. I'm not saying the Liberals will win the election, but they could get into the 20s and cause some worries for the other opposition parties. The CAQ has been again stumbling along for this fall, and so we have a full calendar year now. Remember that poll that was in November 2023, the first poll that showed the Parti Québécois ahead. It was a pulse poll, and the PQ hasn't looked back since, and the CAQ looks lost. And when you look at those numbers from Léger, the satisfaction number, right, that blew me away, more than voting intentions. The CAQ lost 6 points in satisfaction number since, I think the poll was in August. No, it was September. It was September. So I'm not surprised at all by this. The only party that looks to have his stuff together is the Parti Québécois. The Québec Solidaire also has had its own problems. The Conservatives, the Québec Conservatives, Éric Duhem, 11% is near the average of what we're seeing. So to see that 35% for the Parti Québécois, 14-point lead. You said a massive majority. I'm updating my Quebec projection today. It looks like the majority the CAQ had in 2018 for the Parti Québécois. Very split vote, but just loading up on Francophone voters. All these CAQ seats surrounding Montreal, the 450, the 450, would go to the Parti Québécois. And now the question becomes, Eric, how long is François Legault going to take this? Because François Legault, I mentioned this before, he built a good coalition there. It worked. He won 2 majority governments. But we know that it relies a lot on him, and his personal numbers are poor. We've been saying for how long, Trudeau is going to leave soon because he has poor personal numbers. Well, look at Léger poll. François Legault numbers, satisfaction numbers, are identical to Justin Trudeau. He's not going to stay for if 1 year from now we see these numbers again in Quebec, he's not going to stick around to get beaten in an election, and badly beaten too, right?
Fifth election for him.
Yeah. And I think it's a long time. It's a grind. And also, again, pandemic years were more of a grind. So even though he was, walking on clouds during the pandemic, it's still, it takes a toll on someone. But the fact that he's going to be, 69, I think, next year, getting closer to 70, his numbers, why would he stick around if he sees that he's going to... he still has time, but he won't stick around if he sees those numbers are tanking by next year. So I think that you and I, next year, will have an episode about who will be the next CAQ leader, which could be fun. There could be lots of options, but we'll get to this at some point. But I wanted to mention it's not just the CAQ that's down, it's himself. It's Legault himself.
I wonder, any disappointed Conservative MPs who didn't make it into Pierre Poilievre's new cabinet, maybe they think, maybe I should be Premier instead. Maybe make the jump. Just one last thing I wanted to mention, if his numbers get worse. So the Liberals will choose their new leader in, June?
June 14th, yeah.
And Pablo Rodriguez seems to be the front runner, the Liberal MP, who's apparently going to give up his seat after the kind of date for having to call a by-election passes in early January. Hypothetical poll, always big margin on that, but Rodriguez boosts the Liberals to 26%, and the CAQ is the main one who falls. They drop to 15%. So imagine then, we're talking a year from now, maybe Rodriguez is leader of the Liberals, and the CAQ is 10 points back in third, 10 points of the second place.
Yeah.
That's when it seems impossible for Legault to stick around. We might have... Because once the federal election is past us, we almost have a year, assuming Newfoundland goes early too or something, we almost have a year before, over a year before another election. There's going to be lots of
Is that so?
26 is looking to be pretty light, gotta say. Assuming there's not a Liberal leadership contest or something like that. NDP leadership.
Well, well, I mean, you would expect one, right? And also an NDP leadership contest. You would hope so for their sake. But yeah, 2026 is going to be all about Quebec, as it should be, my friend, as it should be. So, but yeah, so by the way, guys, in that poll shows that he would basically finish the CAQ. Because the CAQ at 21% in that poll would win a handful of seats. That's it. But not 15, not 12, a handful. If the Liberals get a popular leader to take them back, I'm careful to what to say contention, because 26% historically is still bad for the Liberals, but it's much better than what we've seen in the past decade. But 15% for the CAQ would be the end. It would be nothing left. They would be behind Québec Solidaire in seats and probably behind Éric Duhaime, which would have to be painful for them to consider. But one thing at a time.
All right, where are we going next?
Okay, so I have a little quiz for you.
Okay, wasn't sure.
I decided to keep a format that we've used lately. It's a very short one, but it's revisiting elections of past. And right now, again, in honor of what we think there will be an election in Ontario very soon.
It could be. I thought you were going to send me to Nova Scotia again.
Did you hear that, people in Atlantic Canada?
It didn't go well.
Eric did not want a quiz because I'm keeping that for next week, my friend. So I decided to go not that far in the past. The last time a Ontario government tried for a third majority. When was the last time that happened, Eric?
A third majority.
They went for a third. I'm not saying they did it, but
it would be McGuinty in 2011.
And that's exactly where we are going. So the Ontario election 2011. How comfortable are you with your Ontario map from 2011?
From 2011, I'm not sure. That was a big election. I remember that. I had projections on 308 and all that, but we'll see. We'll see how much I can remember.
So the overall result was a minority for the Dalton-McGuinty OLP, but a minority by one seat. They fell one seat short of a majority.
54, right?
The threshold was 54. They had 53.
53,
that's
right.
So the game is it a rainbow or is it a sweep? I'm giving you three ridings that are next to each other, that touch each other. You have to tell me if it was won by all the same party, and if so, which party? Or if it was won by three different parties, and you have to tell me which one was won by which party. So, Similar format. I have 5 trios here. Gold is 5, silver is 4, bronze is 2, shame is 1, and bronze is 3, sorry, shame is 1 and 2, or 0. Are you ready, my friend?
I am. Let's go.
Okay, so we are going near the Niagara region, a region that's close to my heart. I lived there for a while. That's where I learned English. And I'm giving you 3 ridings. St. Catharines, Niagara West, Glenbrook, and Welland, where there's a Francophone community in Welland. So
was there?
Yeah. I went. I remember I was 19 years old, and I went to a bar that had this the Franco-Ontarian flag, and I went there and we all spoke French with that Franco-Ontarian accent, which I love. So was that a sweep by a party, or was it a rainbow? 3 different parties, and if so, which?
Well, I know that the Liberals would have won St. Catharines because there was Jim Bailey, I think, who was the MPP, and he had been there forever. So at least that riding went Liberal. So did the other 2 go in different areas? I'm going to say they probably did. So I'm going to say the NDP won Welland and the PCs won Niagara, Glenbrook.
And you are correct. The NDP did win Welland. It was Cindy Foster, and it was Tim Hudak that was in Niagara West, Glenbrook, right? Leader of the opposition. Right. And St. Catharines, it was Jim Bradley, as you said.
Bradley, yes.
Yeah, we're close. Okay, all right. We are going north of Toronto. 3 ridings. Barrie, York Simcoe, and Durham.
Those all have to be PC. Because Barrie was... Well, at the time, it would have been Patrick Brown, but at the federal level, York Simcoe is always a PC riding, and Durham would have been as well. I think that was Could that have been Aaron O'Toole's father or something like that? He was there at some point. But anyway, I'm going to say it was a PC sweep.
Okay, Barrie was won by Rod Jackson of the PCs. York Simcoe was won by Julia Munro of the PCs.
Yes.
And in Durham, it was John O'Toole. Good call. Good call. All right. So a PC sweep. What's that region? Is it? I just said north of Toronto, but that's. Do we say Central Ontario? What is Simcoe?
Well, I guess
Barrie?
you could say Central Ontario. I mean, it's like York region, and Durham.
We had this discussion with our patron members on a Discord, and there was no consensus on what to call that region. That's why I'm asking.
Ontario doesn't have regions.
Okay, we're going in Northern Ontario. Algoma Manitoulin, Nickel Belt, and Timiskaming Cochrane.
I don't think the PCs would have won any of those. I think the NDP would have won Timiskaming and probably Nickel Belt. So I'm going to say it was an NDP sweep.
It was an NDP sweep. Very well. So
I've
Michael
avoided
Manta.
shame. Yes.
Algoma Manitoulin, France Gélina in Nickel Belt, and Timiskaming Cochrane by John Vantoff of the NDP. So you're 3 out of 3. You've secured the silver, the bronze.
The bronze.
Already better than in Nova Scotia. I think we're going to go back to Nova Scotia soon. So, okay.
I've done a lot more research over the last few weeks. I might do better.
We are going just west of Toronto. Dufferin Caledon, Bramalia Gore Malton, and Brampton West.
All right. I think you're trying to be interesting. Dufferin Caledon would have been PC. Brampton West would have been Liberal. And Bramalia Gore Malton would have been Jagmeet Singh in the NDP.
Oh, my God. That is a perfect score. That was so quick, too. So you know your 2011 Ontario map very well.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, very well. So you got silver. Can you get that last one? Can you get that last one? We are going in a GTA, just south of where we were. Burlington, Ancaster, Dundas, Glamborough, Westdale, and Hamilton Mountain.
You work by elimination. The NDP could have won Hamilton Mountain. So it's possible. But I'm going to think that it all went Liberal. So I'm going to say Liberal sweep.
Ancaster, Dundas, Flamborough, Westdale was won by the Liberal. Burlington was taken by the PCs. And Hamilton Mountain was won by the NDP, so it was a rainbow. But Eric, you get silver, which I think is pretty good considering the Nova Scotia. But good for you. Redemption for Eric on this week's quiz.
Thank you. All right, number of the week. Why don't you go first?
Okay, 37% in that Leger poll. 30% of respondents are in favor of Quebec sovereignty. This is near the average of what we've seen for the past year and a half. Even though the Parti Québécois more than double its support and voting intentions, sovereignty has moved between 35 and 40. 40 was more with Pals Data. But in Leger polling, it's been in the mid to high 30s, and it hasn't moved. And when you look at the age breakdown, young people, 31%, 35 to 54, 34%, and 55 and over, 43%. So there is still, important generational gap in support for sovereignty. 37% is a good starting point for the Parti Québécois, but they still have a lot of work to do if they want to. If they want to run the next election on sovereignty, they will get a good score, but they will hit a ceiling as well.
Yeah. All right, my number of the week is going to be 47.7. This was the share of the vote that the BC NDP got in the 2020 provincial election. That was their best performance ever, and that was under John Horgan, who was the premier from 2017 to 2022. He very sadly passed away this past week. He had been ambassador to Germany, and he had been diagnosed with cancer for the third time and passed away. He was only 65 years old. Seemed to be a very human person, a politician. We don't often see that. And he just seemed to be well respected by everybody who knew him. So Our condolences to his friends and family, to British Columbians, so John Horgan. Well, for the BC NDP, probably one of their most successful leaders. So it's a sad legacy. It's a good legacy, but it's sad that he had to pass away far too early.
Did you say that's the highest vote share of the NDP in British Columbia? Yep. Oh, I didn't know that. Wow, interesting. Yeah, so
rest in 2020.
Rest in peace, Mr. Horgan. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so that'll be it for this week's episode of The Numbers. We're going to record our mailbag episode. We got a lot of good questions, a lot about the polling industry. We have a lot of questions that we're going to answer about that. If you'd like to listen and you're not already a member of our Patreon, you can go to thenumberspod.ca. We're also going to be launching, probably on Friday, a poll for our special episode that we're going to record at the end of the month. That'll also be for members. We don't know what the topic will be just yet. We're going to leave that up to members to decide. So you can go to thenumberspod.ca to sign up and to take part in our Discord and support the work that we're doing. So, Philip, I'm looking forward to doing that and looking forward to chatting with you in a week.
All right. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you, everybody. Head over to the mailbag.